predecessor, I was determined to turn things around, to invest in America.
I was putting gas in the car the other day and I walked in to buy a candy bar, which I don't do too often, and I looked down and it was $2.29. I was like, I'm not buying this candy. I can afford the candy bar, but I refuse to buy this candy bar.
I made it clear to him that it's not the business of the United States to be giving a Democratic ally advice about when to have an election.
Hello, I'm Nicole Killian in Washington, and welcome to America Decides. President Biden is wrapping up a West Coast trip to Nevada and Arizona. There, he highlighted his economic policies and made an appeal to Latino voters. In 2020, Arizona was a key victory that propelled him to the White House. Biden outpaced Trump among Hispanic voters in the state by 24 points in the last election. Arfin Gomez is here with me now, and Weijia Zhang is in Phoenix, where she's been following the president. And Weijia, I'd like to start with you. And of course, the president's visit today in Arizona, he announced an agreement with Intel for nearly $20 billion in funding and grants to boost computer chip manufacturing. This is something, of course, the administration says will create thousands of new jobs. How is that resonating with voters on the ground? And overall, how are they feeling about the economy?
Well, Nicole, they say that the problem is they hear what the administration is saying, and they hear the president's message about everything that he has done to give Americans more breathing room when it comes to making ends meet. The issue, they say, is that they are not feeling it. And that is why they're wondering whether these policies actually have an impact. And I think, at the end of the day, the president is asking for more time. Even with the announcements that you talked about today, these are investments that are going to take years to play out, years for those jobs to come to fruition. And so there isn't this instant gratification that some people may be looking for, and that is why they feel the way they do right now. Take a listen.
And it's just an example. I was putting gas in the car the other day and I walked in to buy a candy bar, which I don't do too often, and I looked down and it was $2.29. I was like, I'm not buying this candy. I can afford the candy bar, but I refuse to buy this candy bar because I'm not paying $2.29 for a candy bar. Right. And look, and I can afford toilet paper and chicken and everything that that we need.
The principle of it. Right?
But
it used to be that we could go out and do things, go out to dinner, once, twice a week. Now, no, that's not happening. We have to budget everything down to the finest thing, and the cost of healthcare and medical has gone up.
And I will say that a couple of those voters said yes, definitively, that the economy was better under former President Trump. But then one weighed in and said, well, that's because Trump didn't have to deal with a worldwide pandemic. And who's to say that he would have done a better job than Biden? And so they did take that into consideration and have a conversation about how that is true, and that, Biden had an uphill battle to fight from the moment he took office.
Yeah, and obviously the pandemic starting under the Trump administration or towards the end of his administration. So to a certain extent, he did have to deal with it. But in comparison, I guess if you could expand on that, and how do these voters feel about former President Trump?
Well, it's funny because all three of these voters tell us that they are not 100% decided about who they want to vote for. And as you know, we are in Arizona, and the issue of border security is a big one. And so while they say President Biden hasn't really done anything effective to deal with the flow of migrants, they also say it's difficult for them to stomach Trump's rhetoric. And every time they think they can support the former president, he says something that changes their mind in an instant. Take a listen to that.
I keep waiting for Trump to somehow or another calm down, and then just the other day he mentions this thing about a bloodbath if he loses. And with Joe Biden, he's 81 years old. Yeah. He's not getting any younger.
Mm-hmm. Age is a big factor for me. I mean, I think Trump hides it better because he's always just snapping and talking, and where Joe Biden, sometimes he's just like standing at the podium and you could tell he just like loses his thought, or he needs help to form sentences.
Do you feel like you'll be looking at the vice presidential candidate more than usual?
Yes, more than usual.
And so That's why they say they'll be paying close attention, and that it's really going to matter who Donald Trump picks as his running mate, because that could be a deciding factor for them as they try to make up their minds before November.
And, Finn, just to kind of piggyback off of that, I mean, we heard from some of those voters there talking about the former president's rhetoric at times, but also there's the issue of his legal troubles as well. There are obviously some developments related to some of the cases he's facing in New York and Georgia. Many experts I talked to say they find it hard to believe that some of these cases will go to trial even before the election. I mean, how are the former president's legal issues impacting voters? Do they care?
At this point, you're seeing that it isn't really a factor in some of these recent polling that we've seen. However, I do think it serves as a reminder that this president, the former president, this has been a long-held tactic that he has utilized throughout his professional career. Delay, delay, delay. And in this instance, what you're seeing in the several cases is that many of these may not come to trial or may not be decided by the November 5th election.
Which could work to his benefit.
Which could absolutely work to his benefit. And you are seeing that. There was a poll out earlier this week that did show that it did have some impact. If he was convicted, let's say, in that Manhattan hush money trial, it could have an impact with independent voters, something that both campaigns have said they are targeting.
And then also kind of getting back to the state of Arizona, the significance of Latino voters in particular. I mean, you were just in the state as well. I mean, how critical is this state for both candidates, both President Biden, former President Trump, and also this demographic when we're talking about Latino voters and voters of color overall?
I think what you're seeing is that the Latino vote, is specifically in battleground states like Arizona and Nevada, are crucial to both campaigns, and they're making it a top priority for their strategy looking to November. If you recall, in 2020, this was a state that was decided by 10,000 votes, Nicole. That small margin is what decided that election, helped decide that election. There are 36 million, potentially 36 million eligible Latino voters this time around. That's almost double since 2008. It is a crucial part of the Biden coalition in 2020. And if you look at some of our own latest polling, there was a poll that we had that came out last month that showed that Biden was down by 12 points since 2020 among Hispanic voters.
So what are some of the tactics that the campaign is doing to try to win some of those folks back or keep them in their column?
Yeah, and it is, they're focusing on issues that they think matter to this crucial Latino vote. But it's not just immigration, Nicole. As we saw earlier in the show, it's about the economy. It's about cost of things as well. But they're looking. They have a robust ad strategy. You saw that not just in Spanish and English, but also in Spanglish, which many Latinos, including yours truly, utilizes. It's a smart maneuver, they believe, to try to appeal to that to those Latino voters. And also, they've also emphasized, the president himself said in Phoenix, he pointed to the remarks by former President Trump in Ohio last week, where he said that migrants were not people, that they were animals in some cases, and some of that rhetoric is really something that could impact some of these voters who are still undecided which way they will vote.
All right. And then very briefly, Weija, what else did you hear from voters during your time there in Phoenix?
Well, I think they wanted to stress that they understand how important their vote is because they are in one of just a handful of swing states, and they understand how critical the Latino vote is. But they tell me they are not a monolith, and it's really difficult to just use one ad campaign to reach out to everybody because there are so many varying opinions and priorities within the Latino community. The one thing they agreed on, though, is that in their culture, they say they don't like it when people beat around the bush. They want people to get to the point, and they're tired of hearing Biden's rhetoric and flowery language. They want to hear more details. They want to hear a specific platform about what he plans to do, so they do feel the benefit of his policies instead of just listening to him talk about it.
All right, Weija Zhang in Phoenix, Finn Gomez here with me in Washington. Thanks so much. CBS exit polling out of Ohio found that voters in the state trust Republicans more when it comes to handling the economy. We'll discuss with the White House economic advisor next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. President Biden is in Arizona unveiling his $8.5 billion agreement with tech giant Intel. The funding is part of the CHIPS Act. Intel will also be given $11 billion in loans for computer chip plants in 4 states. The investment will create 30,000 manufacturing and construction jobs.
Nearly all manufacturing of leading-edge chips across the entire industry moved overseas to Asia years ago. That's why today's investment is such a big deal. We will enable advanced semiconductor manufacturing to make a comeback here in America after 40 years.
Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve today left interest rates unchanged. The central bank suggested it still expects to cut rates 3 times this year. Chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, Jared Bernstein, joins us now. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, we'll get to the Fed's announcement in a moment. But first, what does today's investment by the president say about the administration's efforts to bring chips manufacturing back in the United States?
It says that this president not only understands the importance of this, but he can deliver. In so many cases, we've heard aspirations to invest in our infrastructure and our manufacturing under our predecessor's administration without the legislation to back it up. Now, here we had a bipartisan piece of critically important, really transformational legislation in the CHIPS Act, and now we're talking about bringing domestic manufacturing of this extremely important component, semiconductors, back to our shores. We invented semiconductors. We invented their manufacturing. We used to produce 40% of the chips. Now we're down to 10%. This president not only wants to reverse that, but he has the legislative chops to make it happen. And it was just great seeing him out there today talk about this landmark investment in Arizona.
And then back to the Fed's decision today and, the decision to hold rates steady. How do you think that will impact the average American?
Well, we're pretty careful not to get into the Fed's knitting, and so we let their decision and the commentary around that stand for itself. I will point out one thing that I thought was interesting in the report. They upgraded their forecast for economic growth for this year. I think it was 1.4%. They upgraded it to 2.1. At the same time, we've seen inflation come down by 2/3 off of its peak. This is a remarkable development. We've seen strong economic growth and yet considerably lower inflation. Now, we have a lot more work to do when it comes to lowering costs, and we're doing so. In fact, one of the ways you do that is you build out domestic manufacturing right here in this country. That's not just national security, that's economic security. But you also go after the high price of housing, which this president has a great agenda on, junk fees, prescription drugs, and more. So that's all fits, quite neatly into what we're trying to do here.
And our Weijia Zhang sat down with several voters in Arizona, as you may have heard, to get their take on the economy. Let's take a listen.
I can, afford toilet paper and chicken and everything that that we need.
The principle of it.
But there's a lot of people that can't.
We have to budget everything down to the finest thing, and the cost of healthcare and medical has gone up.
I feel like right now the first-time home buyer, they're priced out. If you make $20 an hour, you cannot buy a house by yourself.
So I know you said that inflation has come off of its peak, but, what do you say to Americans like that who may not be feeling the tangible impacts yet?
Yeah, great question, Nicole. I did say inflation's down 2/3 off of its peak, but I also said right after that, we have more work to do. And just there, I thought you heard a very clear articulation of the work that we have to do. I think the question that folks should ask themselves is there evidence of that work being undertaken by this administration? The answer is an unequivocal yes. You just heard someone talking about the challenge buying a home for the first time. Well, the president, actually, he talked about that earlier this week. I think that was Tuesday. It feels like weeks ago, given how much he's been up to lately. He talked about his plan for a first-time homebuyer tax credit. That would have the effect of lowering the mortgage rate by 1.5 or 2 percentage points for people just like the one you spoke to. When it comes to our lowering costs agenda, whether it's groceries, housing, whether it's healthcare, prescription drugs, healthcare coverage, as I mentioned earlier, junk fees, checking fees, overdraft fees. We're actively working, and we've had some success in that space. We just have to keep pushing. The question isn't, are we there yet? We're not. Are we pushing in the right direction? And especially in contrast to those who would offer an alternative set of policies, which looks to us extremely divorced from everything you just heard from those voters.
CBS News exit polling out of Ohio yesterday found that more voters actually trust Republicans to handle the economy over Democrats. And while I know you said there's still more work to do you think there's a disconnect there?
Well, I think what happens sometimes is we ask these very broad questions that invoke partisanship and party affiliation, and I understand that. But you started this segment showing a president standing near a groundbreaking of historic proportions, one of the largest investments in semiconductors in this country ever, in the state of Ohio, in the state of Arizona, where he was today, in New Mexico, in Oregon. And you're talking about tens of thousands of good, high-quality jobs, many for non-college educated workers. I'm not sure what else we can do other than deliver precisely those kinds of programs and policies to the American people right here on American soil. You saw a president saying, I'm going to bring these jobs back to America. Now, let me offer you the following to you, because you have a television station and you could probably do this poll. I'd like to ask the same folks we're talking to, maybe even the same ones who spoke to that poll you just gave us, what they think about that, what they think about this president's agenda bringing jobs back to America to enhance our economic national security in the critical area of semiconductor production. I'd love to see the results of that poll.
All right, Jared Bernstein, we hope to have you back, and thank you so much for being with us tonight.
My pleasure.
A Fulton County judge will allow former President Trump to appeal his decision allowing District Attorney Fani Willis to continue prosecuting the Georgia 2020 election case. Last week, the judge rejected a bid by the defendants to disqualify Willis from prosecuting the case because of a romantic relationship she had with the case's former special prosecutor, Nathan Wade. Trump's lawyer said in a statement that the defense team is, quote, optimistic the DA will be disqualified. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke with Republican lawmakers today, what he's saying amid tensions with Democrats about the war in Gaza. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Sources tell CBS News the spending bill agreed to by congressional leaders and the White House will include a ban on all direct funding to the United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees until March 2025. Israel has accused over a dozen UNRWA employees of participating in the October 7th attack. Earlier today, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed Republican senators virtually, this less than a week after Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer called for new elections in Israel. Senate GOP leaders had this to say after the meeting.
I made it clear to him that it's not the business of the United States to be giving a Democratic ally advice about when to have an election or what kind of military campaign they may be conducting.
Our members conveyed to the Israeli Prime Minister our strong support for their efforts to defeat once and for all and get rid of the influence of Hamas.
And our Margaret Brennan is here with me now. Margaret, I know you've been doing a lot of reporting on this today. So what impact could this ban on funding to UNRWA have on the distribution of aid to Gaza?
Well, currently, USAID has been paused because of the investigation that you mentioned into those allegations about the 12 employees, 12 among 13,000 employees. But what this would immediately do, according to UNRWA, would have an immediate impact on those who are starving. Remember, we're talking about famine-like conditions being imminent. So you are looking at the agency that has the most infrastructure to shelter, feed, give any kind of medical support now saying they don't know where their next few dollars are coming from. Saudi Arabia did say they'd make a $40 million pledge today, but the U.S. gives hundreds of millions.
But do we know what was behind the decision, or is it just that this investigation is still underway?
Well, two things. In terms of the motivation of the Republicans who pushed for this block, it was very specifically to carry out the wishes of the Netanyahu government and also to respond to the allegations that Israeli intelligence made about these 12. The UN is conducting its own investigation. It hasn't concluded it. And in fact, they have to re-vet employees. The U.S. intelligence community did not do their own assessment. They are relying on the Israeli assessment and saying it was credible. So that is still pending. But in terms of the immediate funding, it was a Republican-led effort to do this. There were Democrats like Senator Chris Van Hollen, who was on my program Sunday, warning that if this happens, it is going to have a really devastating impact, because what we know now, it's not just about getting trucks with food in or airdropping food, it's distributing it. And when you don't have a network to distribute it, and Save the Children has told us no one can step in and do this other than UNRWA, UNICEF, others. So to really gut that organization will have an impact. The White House didn't want to, they claim, but they have gone along with in order to avoid a government shutdown, because this was tucked into a funding bill.
And then in terms of the prime minister's address to Senate Republicans today, what more do we know about his message to lawmakers, and why did he specifically address Senate Republicans as opposed to senators as a whole?
Well, according to Senator Barrasso, one of the lead Senate Republicans, he asked the prime minister to speak to them, and Senator Schumer was offered the choice and declined the offer. But this is a political punchback. I mean, there's no question about this. This is a response to the fact that the majority leader, who views himself in a unique role as the highest-ranking Jewish official in American history, to speak with the authority he felt he had on the moral issues he laid out in this speech. His speech was very specific. He didn't just talk about Israeli elections. He called for Palestinian leaders to step down. He called for Netanyahu to disavow the right-wing extremists within his government who have used bigoted language and advocated for bigoted policies. That's what he said in his speech. So it wasn't just, trying to unseat a leader. It was very specific and driving towards a peace agreement. But the Republican framing of this is that this was dirty politics or regime change. And it's something that, of course, a number of Democratic officials raised their eyebrows at, given how openly Benjamin Netanyahu voices influence in American politics. Jake Sullivan went to the podium at the White House, the national security advisor, and said, basically no other foreign leader is on American airwaves speaking to American audiences quite so frequently. So he said
I guess, what do you make of that?
Well, he has an important audience here in the United States. The United States and Israel have this really unique relationship in terms of funding, military and intelligence support, and also the Israeli government views their consulate in New York City to be their most important diplomatic outpost in the world because of the number of American Jews who live there in that city, and their view that the diaspora has a vested interest in the future of the Jewish democratic state. So there is a unique relationship there, but the influence into American politics is where this is getting really dirty really quick. And you see that playing out here now. But this isn't the first time. As you know, 2015, you remember Benjamin Netanyahu spoke to that joint session of Congress, bypassing the president, Barack Obama, and going instead and dealing just with Republicans in control of the Congress. That was hugely controversial and caused a diplomatic incident at the time.
And Speaker Mike Johnson even today saying he may invite the prime minister to address Congress again. Margaret Brennan, we thank you so much for your expertise as always.
Thank you.
And of course, you can see more from Margaret on Face the Nation right here on CBS News Streaming at 12 p.m. and 4 p.m. Eastern. That does it for us today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. You are streaming CBS News.